Before we get into the stories, I would like to let you all know that I'm taking story submissions to narrate. I will credit you in the description of the video unless you ask me not to, so if you have an experience or story in mind that you would like me to read, then you can email me at feedingonfear@gmail.com, and I will be sure to include it in my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and enjoy the stories. My avid interest in the human body began as a young teen, but it was so subtle. It began with tiny things, taking apart mechanical devices, remotes, electronics, even a bed. I was so curious. I just wanted to know what made up these things, and what made them move, what made them come alive and do what they do. It was such a fantastic mystery, pulling apart a computer to find millions of parts that hum and vibrate. The only problem is that I could never put the mess of bolts and bits back together. Eventually, my parents got sick of me destroying things in the house, so they would buy me books to try and quell my unrestrained desire to pull apart objects. Sadly, that only subdued me for so long. After being hit, beaten, and screamed at by my parents, I stopped, until I started learning about the anatomy of animals. I think we've all squished spiders and killed ants, whatever the reason may have been. It happened. I did this as a kid, but I never thought about cutting them open and actually looking at what's inside of them. It was a summer day, and I was relaxing outside, and our dog Alex brought me a present, a rat. I remember ripping it from his mouth, feeling the rat, which was still alive. It squirmed and struggled in my hand. I would have thrown it away and forgotten about it, but I felt something. A pulse, a single heartbeat. I had felt my own before, but never thought much of it. Now I had something that shared a piece of me. I was so curious and ecstatic to find out what made it beat and move. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went on to the back patio. I held the rat down on the little table we had out there and began to saw my way into its body. I only got so far until I hit the ribs, so at that point I dug my fingernails into the incisions I had made and began to pull apart the skin. I dug even further into this rat and pulled apart the ribs, snapping them and tossing them into the trash behind me. I'd pulled apart almost all of its ribs so that I had a clear view of its heart. I was amazed but disappointed. In my haste, I had forgotten that I was killing it. The heart was still and broken, and I frowned. What point was there to look at it now? In my anger, I began slicing at random, tearing the rat to shreds and covering the table in its guts and blood. After I could cut no longer, my anger ceased. I looked down at the bloody mess on the table in my hands. I heard car tires on the gravel and knew that my parents had come home. So I quickly washed off the blood and tossed the bones and guts into the woods. As I grew older, it grew to other things. I occasionally cut open a mole or a squirrel, but I was always so careful. All I wanted was to see the heartbeat, but every time I got that deep, the animal would die. I would go frustrated and mutilate what was left of it. I had to be sure my parents never found out what I did was a secret. The closest I ever came to getting caught was in high school. We were in biology class. We were learning about the anatomy of animals, specifically the frog. I had been waiting so long for the day that we would get to dissect it. It came, painfully slow, and when it did come, I was so joyful and ecstatic that I was shaking. Frogs didn't usually hang around my house, so this was a first-time experience. We were working in pairs, and I hadn't even noticed who my partner was. My face lit up when my teacher set down a small metal tray with 2 frogs neatly taped to it. We were separated into sections with small walls in between each section, giving everyone privacy. Each section had a small trash can under the table to dispose of the frogs. I sat down next to my partner and took the scalpel, and my partner began to talk about what we need to do. and I completely ignored him. I began cutting away, inspecting and enjoying each thing I cut out. It went from a slow and steady pace to a rampage. I simply sliced and cut, feeling a growing sense of bliss. My partner stared with complete disbelief at me, but I continued. Soon there was nothing left on the tray except the other frog and a pile of unrecognizable guts and pieces. I calmly dumped my bits into the trash can, walked up to the teacher, and told her that I had to go to the nurse. My partner never spoke to me again. But now, I can't contain it anymore. I went to medical school to try and become a surgeon, but I can't wait. This morning, I called the cable company complaining about my TV acting up, and they sent a mechanic over. I told him that my TV was in the basement. I followed him down the stairs, and before he could ask where the TV was, I took a baseball bat and whacked him over the head with it. I tied him to the bed and began to sharpen my butcher's knife. When he came to his senses, I had just finished sharpening my knife. He struggled against his leather restraints as I brought the knife near his hand. Turning it sideways, I began to slowly peel the skin away. I'd given him painkillers, but the look on his face was still of pure terror. He tried to scream out loud, but I dragged him. I dug the knife into his raw hand just half an inch and began to peel away bits of muscle and skin. I'd reached the tendons, and one by one I began to pull them out. Each pluck sent a shock through his body, and finally I undid his hand strap. He tried to move his hand, but it hung limply. He was barely conscious now, so I gave him some more painkillers. I then began to work at his legs, repeating the same process that I did with his hands. Now his legs were raw, and both his hands and his legs were bleeding freely. Before I could finish his legs, he passed out, and his legs stopped struggling. And I felt angry, and I got into my old habits. I slashed and stabbed his legs, ripping them to shreds until I reached bone. I sharpened my knife again and began to cut his fingers off one by one, and he died as soon as I began this process. I got so frustrated. I didn't even begin with his head or torso. I began sawing away at his face, ripping out chunks of flesh. I cut a laceration from ear to ear, opening his mouth. I cut his throat near the top and pulled his tongue through. I finished by completely ripping out his vocal cords and cutting all along his neck. I got too curious, so frustrated that everything died before I could finish. But I had a wild idea. What about me? I smiled and brought the knife to my upper left part of my torso, where the heart was. I took as many painkillers as I could and began to cut and slice. Looking down at my bloody torso, I felt pure and utter joy. And then it happened. I pulled out a small red object, and it gave me one single beat, one slow and utter beat. And then it stopped.